Here is the first portion of the requested voiceover script, preserving the original style and content.
Let me know when to continue. Step out of the car now.
The officer barked, his voice cutting through the stillness of the parking lot like a whip. She turned to face him, calm yet firm, standing beside her unmarked patrol car. Dressed in plain clothes, she looked nothing like the authority she carried. "I'm authorized to be here," she said, her voice steady.
But he wasn't listening.
His hand was already resting on his holster.
"Don't argue with me. Step back or I'll make you."
The hostility was thick in the air, clinging to her skin like an insult.
She raised a hand, trying to de-escalate. "You don't want to do this. Just let me."
Before she could finish, he moved. Quick. Aggressive. His shove sent her stumbling against her car. "People like you don't belong here," he snarled. Her breath hitched. People like you, it wasn't the first time she'd heard it, but it stung all the same. The humiliation burned hotter than the ache in her back. Straightening herself, she brushed the dust off her jacket. "What did you just say?" she asked, locking eyes with him.
"I said you don't belong here.
Now leave before I have to call backup." His sneer was laced with condescension, his posture screaming authority, a misplaced, arrogant authority he thought was unshakable. But then she did something that stopped him cold. Slowly, she reached into her pocket. His hand flinched toward his weapon, but she wasn't pulling out a gun.
No. It was far worse for him.
The badge. His eyes widened as he stared at the shiny emblem in her hand, Chief of Police. The color drained from his face.
For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't move.
All he could do was process the reality that he had just shoved, literally shoved, into a corner. She stepped closer, her voice calm but icy.
"Let me explain something to you. I don't answer to you.
In fact, you answer to me." The silence that followed was deafening. He fumbled for words, stammering something incoherent, but she wasn't finished.
"Do you even know who I am?"
Her voice was low but sharp enough to cut through steel.
"Do you have any idea what you've just done?"
He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He was choking on his own arrogance, on the weight of what had just unraveled. What followed that night set off a chain reaction no one saw coming.
His fate and hers would intertwine in ways neither could have predicted.
The humiliation he dished out so easily was about to become his downfall, but not in the way anyone expected. What was waiting for him wasn't just punishment. It was a lesson, one that would shake his foundation and leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about power, respect, and justice. But how does one moment of blind prejudice spiral into a confrontation that leaves an entire police department reeling? What does justice look like when the tables turn so drastically? Stay with us, because this is a story you need to hear to believe. Hello, and welcome to Plow of Twist. Before we dive into today's gripping story, I want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black audience and anyone who has ever faced injustice. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel is a space to shed light on these issues, honor resilience, and inspire change. We believe that storytelling has the power to bring awareness and unite people. So if you enjoy stories of triumph and justice, be sure to subscribe to our channel and join our growing community. Now, get comfortable because this is a story you don't want to miss. The air in the precinct parking lot was heavy with the lingering smell of rain. Dim lights buzzed overhead, casting shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. This was a part of the city where ambition and desperation often collided, a place where power played out in subtle glances and overt commands. It wasn't a glamorous precinct, but it was hers. Chief Naomi Harris was a woman who carried authority like armor. At 43, she had earned her position through grit, intellect, and an unrelenting drive to prove every doubter wrong. As the first Black woman to lead the department, her journey had been riddled with resistance and quiet hostility. But Naomi was no stranger to adversity. Raised by her grandmother in the heart of Atlanta, she learned early on that the world didn't hand out fairness freely. If she wanted respect, she had to command it brick by brick, step by step. Naomi's ascent in law enforcement had been anything but typical. She started as a beat cop, working the late-night shifts no one else wanted, patrolling streets that mirrored her own childhood. Her ability to read people, to understand their fears and motivations, made her an exceptional officer. She had a knack for de-escalating situations, a calm but firm demeanor that earned her trust among the communities she served. But it also drew envy. She was too sharp, too driven, too much for some of her colleagues who were content with mediocrity. Her promotion to chief had been a bittersweet moment. On the one hand, it was a victory not just for her, but for every woman and person of color who had been told they didn't belong. On the other, it put her in the crosshairs of scrutiny. Some of the older officers barely concealed their resentment. They saw her as an outsider, an anomaly in a system designed to protect them, not challenge them. And that's exactly what she had done, challenged the status quo. One of those officers was Mark Daniels. A 15-year veteran of the force, Mark had joined the department in his early 20s with a chip on his shoulder and a narrow view of the world. At 38, he was known for his aggressive policing tactics and his disdain for what he called political correctness. To Mark, the badge was a symbol of control, and he wielded it without much thought for nuance or empathy. He didn't like being questioned, least of all by someone like Naomi. Mark's disdain for her wasn't always overt. It showed in small acts of defiance, ignoring direct orders, making snide remarks during meetings, and quietly undermining her authority whenever he thought he could get away with it. Naomi noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But she also knew how to pick her battles. Mark wasn't her biggest problem, not yet. The night of the incident began like any other. Naomi had stayed late at the precinct, going over budgets and personnel reports in her office. She didn't like the administrative side of her job, but it was necessary. The weight of leadership wasn't glamorous, it was exhausting. By the time she stepped outside, the parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few squad cars and the hum of distant traffic. She had planned to leave quietly, unnoticed. But fate had other plans. Mark was returning from a patrol, frustrated and irritable. He'd spent the evening dealing with a noise complaint in one of the city's wealthier neighborhoods, a task he found beneath him. When he spotted Naomi standing by her unmarked car in plain clothes, his assumptions took over. He prided himself on being able to spot trouble, and to him, Naomi didn't fit the image of someone who belonged there at that hour. Maybe it was her casual attire, or maybe it was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. "Hey, you," he called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. Naomi turned, surprised but calm. She recognized him immediately, though he didn't recognize her. "Yes," she replied evenly, her hand resting on the door handle of her car. "This area is restricted." "You can't be here," he said, approaching her with a swagger that betrayed his sense of superiority. Naomi's brow furrowed. "I work here," she said simply, gesturing toward the building behind them. But Mark wasn't listening. His mind was already racing, cataloging her as a potential threat. Maybe she was lying. Maybe she had stolen a vehicle. He'd heard stories about thieves posing as staff to break into precinct lots. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered, his tone growing harsher. "Excuse me?" Naomi asked, her patience starting to fray. "Don't play games with me," Mark snapped, moving closer. "I said step away from the vehicle." Naomi held her ground, her calm exterior masking a surge of irritation. "Officer Daniels, you're making a mistake," she said firmly. That was when he acted. Out of anger, ego, or something uglier, Mark shoved her hard. Naomi stumbled, catching herself against the car. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The weight of what he'd done, of who he had just put his hands on, hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Naomi straightened, her expression unreadable. "That," she said quietly, "was the second mistake you made tonight." Mark frowned, his bravado faltering. "Second?" he asked, the first flicker of doubt creeping into his voice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her badge. The golden emblem gleamed under the dim parking lot lights, its significance unmistakable. Chief of Police. Mark's face paled. He took a step back, his confidence crumbling as the realization hit him. Naomi didn't say another word.
She didn't have to.
The power dynamic had shifted, and Mark was suddenly very, very small. But this was only the beginning. The events that followed would ripple through the department, exposing fractures and truths that had been buried for too long. For Naomi, it was a chance to assert her authority and prove once again why she deserved her place. For Mark, it was the start of a reckoning he never saw coming. This was more than just a confrontation. It was a moment that would redefine respect, justice, and what it truly meant to lead. The echoes of that night would reach far beyond the parking lot, shaking the very foundation of their world. The morning after the parking lot incident was unusually quiet, but it carried an unspoken tension that rippled through the department. Naomi sat in her office, her fingers pressed against her temple as she read through the report she had demanded from Internal Affairs. She hadn't slept much the night before. The replay of Mark Daniels' arrogant sneer, the force of his shove, and the flicker of panic in his eyes when he realized who she was, all of it played in her mind on an endless loop. Her office door creaked open, and Deputy Chief Alan Rodriguez stepped in, his face tight with concern. "Chief," he began carefully, "we've got a situation brewing.
Daniels knows what's coming.
He's already talking to a few of the guys in his circle, trying to rally some support." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing.
Support for what? He violated every protocol in the book. There's no defense for what he did. Alan hesitated. It's not about defense. It's about loyalty. You know how these things go. Some of the old guard don't see you as one of them.
They'll frame this as you being too harsh, too political.
Naomi smirked, though there was no humor in it. Too harsh?
He assaulted his superior officer without cause. If I were a white man, they'd be falling over themselves to condemn him.
This isn't about loyalty, Alan. It's about fear of change. Alan nodded but didn't say more.
He knew Naomi was right, but he also knew how stubborn the old guard could be. The review panel meets in 3 days.
Do you want me to handle the lead on this?
No, Naomi replied firmly.
This is mine to handle.
Daniels needs to know that actions have consequences, not just for him, but for everyone who thinks they can operate above the rules.
Meanwhile, in the locker room, Mark Daniels paced like a caged animal.
A few officers lingered nearby, their faces a mix of discomfort and complicity. Officer Steve Greer, one of Mark's closest allies, leaned against a bench, watching him carefully. "You're blowing this out of proportion, Mark," Steve said, trying to sound reassuring.
It's not like you knew she was the chief. That's not the point.
Mark snapped, his voice filled with frustration.
She's going to make an example out of me. Do you know what that'll do to my career? My pension? Steve shrugged. Maybe you just apologize. Say it was a misunderstanding. That usually works.
Mark stopped pacing and turned to Steve, his eyes blazing.
You think this is about an apology? She's got it out for me. She always has.
Ever since she walked through those doors, she's been trying to take people like us down.
Steve frowned. People like us?
You know what I mean, Mark muttered, avoiding his friend's gaze. In truth, Mark wasn't entirely sure what he meant. But he felt it, the discomfort, the shift in dynamics ever since Naomi Harris became chief. She didn't look at him like the other chiefs had. She didn't nod along to his opinions or brush aside complaints about his methods. She saw him, and it unnerved him. Back in her office, Naomi was reviewing footage from the parking lot incident. It was as damning as she remembered, Mark's aggressive posture, his refusal to listen, the shove, it was all there, crystal clear. But what lingered in her mind was something else. The way he looked at her, not with respect or even caution, but with disdain. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Alan stepped in again, this time looking more concerned. "Chief, there's chatter. Daniels is talking about filing a grievance, claiming you're targeting him because of," Alan hesitated. "Well, because of race."
Naomi raised an eyebrow. He's pulling that card? Alan nodded grimly.
It's a desperate move, but it might stick with some of the guys who already don't like how you're running things.
Naomi sighed, standing up and crossing her arms. Let him.
Let him dig himself deeper. The facts are on my side, and the footage doesn't lie. If he wants to turn this into a public spectacle, I'll be ready. But the public spectacle was already beginning to brew. By the next day, whispers about the incident had made their way beyond the department. The local union representatives were asking questions, and some officers were visibly choosing sides.
Naomi knew she couldn't control the narrative completely, but she could control how she responded. Later that evening, Naomi walked onto the precinct's main floor.
Her presence was commanding as she stepped up to address her team. Conversations hushed as she began to speak. I'm sure you've all heard about the incident in the parking lot, she said, her voice steady but firm.
I won't go into details because this matter is under review.
But let me make one thing clear, accountability applies to everyone, no matter their rank, tenure, or reputation. Our job is to serve and protect, and that starts with respecting each other and the community we serve.
If anyone has an issue with that, my office door is open.
Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Mark stood at the back of the room, his jaw tight as he listened. After the meeting, Steve approached Mark, his tone more cautious this time.
She's not backing down, Mark. Maybe you should.
No, Mark interrupted, his voice low but seething.
She wants to humiliate me. I'm not going to let her win. What Mark didn't realize was that Naomi wasn't interested in humiliating him.
She was interested in exposing a culture that allowed people like him to thrive unchecked. And as the days passed, she began to see just how deep the rot went. Officers who had been quiet about their grievances before were suddenly emboldened, whispering their frustrations in corners and quietly undermining Naomi's authority.
But Naomi wasn't one to back down.
She spent long nights preparing for the review panel, gathering evidence, and documenting every misstep in Mark's career. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every officer who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced because they didn't fit the mold. By the time the review panel convened, the tension in the air was palpable. Mark sat at one end of the room, flanked by his union representative, his expression a mix of defiance and fear. Naomi sat at the other, her posture composed but unyielding. As the panel began, Mark's representative launched into a defense filled with half-truths and misdirection, painting him as a victim of an overzealous chief with a personal agenda. Naomi listened silently, her hands folded in front of her, waiting for her moment.
When it came, she didn't hold back.
She presented the footage, the reports, and the testimonials of other officers who had witnessed Mark's behavior firsthand. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of his defense.
But even as she spoke, Naomi could feel the resistance in the room.
Some of the panel members shifted uncomfortably, their biases evident in their body language. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight against a system that had been designed to protect people like Mark. As the session drew to a close, Naomi looked directly at Mark, her voice steady but piercing.
This isn't about me or you, she said. This is about what kind of department we want to be. Do we want to uphold the values we claim to stand for, or do we want to protect those who tarnish them? The choice is yours.
The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. But the fight was far from over. What happened next would determine not just Mark's fate but the future of the department itself. The review panel had been deliberating for hours. The room where they met was dimly lit, the tension so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Outside, in a cold, stark waiting area, Naomi sat at the end of a bench, her hands clasped tightly together. Her mind churned through every detail of the case she had presented, every fact she had laid bare. This wasn't just about Mark Daniels, it was about what his actions represented and what her response could mean for the future of the department. At the far end of the room, Mark paced back and forth, his agitation growing with each passing minute. His union representative, a wiry man with a furrowed brow, leaned back in a chair, attempting to look calm but failing miserably.
You think they'll side with her?
Mark asked, his voice low but taut with anger. I don't know, the representative replied, glancing toward the closed doors of the panel room.
They're weighing everything. But the footage, it's damning. And the witnesses didn't help our case.
Mark stopped pacing and turned toward him, his jaw tight.
She's trying to ruin me. That's what this is about. She wants me gone because I don't kiss her ass like everyone else. The representative hesitated, then sighed. Look, Mark, let me give you some advice.
If they offer you a deal, take it. Admit the mistake, agree to some sensitivity training, and you might keep your pension.
Mark's face darkened. Admit the mistake? You think I'm going to sit there and say I was wrong to someone like her?
His voice dripped with venom, the bitterness in his words undeniable. The doors to the panel room creaked open, and Deputy Chief Alan Rodriguez stepped out, his expression unreadable.
They're ready, he said, his voice clipped. Naomi stood, smoothing her blazer.
She didn't look at Mark as she walked past him, but she could feel his glare boring into her back. Inside the room, the air was heavy. The panel of 5 members, a mix of senior officers and city officials, sat in a row, their faces a blend of fatigue and determination. At the center sat Captain Evelyn Cross, the panel's chair, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor and sharp mind. "Thank you for your patience," Cross began, her voice steady but grave. "We've reviewed all the evidence, heard from both sides, and deliberated extensively.
This matter is not just about the incident itself but about the broader implications for this department." Naomi's heart pounded in her chest.
She kept her face neutral, but her fingers gripped the edge of the table in front of her. Cross turned her gaze to Mark. "Officer Daniels, your actions in the parking lot were not only a clear violation of protocol but a blatant display of disrespect toward your superior officer. Your refusal to de-escalate, despite multiple opportunities, and your use of unnecessary force reflect poorly on your judgment and character." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched. Cross continued, her voice growing sharper.
"However, what concerns this panel even more is the pattern of behavior that has come to light during this investigation.
Multiple complaints about your conduct, including incidents of excessive force and discriminatory remarks, have surfaced.
These are not isolated events, Officer Daniels. They paint a troubling picture." Mark shot to his feet.
"This is a setup," he barked, his face red with anger. "She's been gunning for me since the day she walked in here. This whole thing is personal, and you're just playing into her hands." "Sit down," Cross snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. Mark hesitated, his chest heaving with fury, but eventually dropped back into his chair, muttering under his breath. Cross turned her attention to Naomi. "Chief Harris, you've made a compelling case, and your commitment to accountability is commendable. But this panel also has to consider the potential impact of its decision on the department as a whole."
Naomi's stomach tightened.
She could sense what was coming, but she kept her expression stoic. "Officer Daniels," Cross said, turning back to him, "this panel recommends your immediate suspension without pay, pending mandatory training and further review.
Any future infractions will result in termination." Naomi's chest burned with frustration. It wasn't enough.
The man had assaulted her, undermined her authority, and shown a pattern of behavior that endangered others. A suspension felt like a slap on the wrist. Mark, on the other hand, looked smug. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a faint smirk as if he had just dodged a bullet. "Thank you for your time," Cross said, signaling the end of the session. As the panel members began to gather their things, Naomi stood. "Captain Cross, if I may," she said. Cross looked up, her expression weary.
"Go ahead, Chief." Naomi stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, this recommendation falls short of what's necessary to address the systemic issues this department is facing. Officer Daniels' actions are not just a personal failing, they're a symptom of a culture that tolerates disrespect, discrimination, and abuse of power.
If we want to rebuild trust with the community and within these walls, we need to do more than slap wrists." The room fell silent. Even Mark stopped smirking, his eyes narrowing as he listened.
Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about vengeance. It's about integrity.
If we allow someone like Officer Daniels to remain in uniform, we're sending a message to every officer who looks up to him and every citizen who looks to us for protection that this behavior is acceptable.
And it's not." Cross studied her for a long moment before nodding.
Your point is noted, Chief Harris.
But this panel's decision is final. Naomi nodded, though a storm brewed behind her eyes.
She gathered her things and left the room without another word.
Outside, Mark caught up to her in the hallway.
Nice speech, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm.
Too bad it didn't work.
Naomi stopped and turned to him, her gaze piercing.
You think this is over? She asked quietly. Mark smirked. It looks over to me.
Naomi leaned in, her voice low but laced with steel.
You're right about one thing. This isn't personal.
But mark my words, Officer Daniels, your time hiding behind that badge is running out.
And when it does, you'll finally understand what accountability looks like.
With that, she walked away, leaving Mark standing alone in the hallway, his smirk fading as the weight of her words settled over him. The precinct buzzed with an uneasy energy the next day. Naomi could feel the tension as she walked through the halls, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Conversations hushed as she passed, officers exchanging glances that spoke volumes. She had expected resistance, but the weight of it was heavier than she anticipated. Still, she kept her head high, her expression unyielding. She had faced worse storms before, and she would weather this one too.
In her office, Naomi sifted through a stack of reports when Alan Rodriguez walked in, his face tense.
We've got a problem, he said, closing the door behind him. Naomi leaned back in her chair, folding her arms.
What now? Daniels? Alan nodded. He's stirring the pot.
He's talking to people, some of the younger guys, a couple of the old-timers. He's spinning this as a vendetta, saying you're targeting him because of personal bias.
Naomi's jaw tightened. Personal bias?
He assaulted me, Alan.
On camera. I know, Alan said, nodding. But some of them are buying into his narrative.
They're saying you've been too hard on him, that you're using this to make a statement. Naomi let out a slow breath, trying to quell the frustration bubbling inside her.
This isn't about him. It's about accountability. If they can't see that, they're part of the problem. Alan hesitated before speaking again. He's not stopping there. Word is he's reaching out to the union and even some local reporters.
He's trying to control the narrative before it gets away from him.
Naomi's eyes narrowed. Let him. If he wants to drag this into the public eye, I'll be ready. Alan gave her a long look. Just be careful, Chief. Daniels isn't just fighting for his job, he's fighting for his pride.
And people like him don't go down quietly. Later that afternoon, Naomi called a department-wide meeting. She stood at the front of the briefing room, her presence commanding, as officers filed in. Mark Daniels was among them, sitting in the back row with his arms crossed and a smug look on his face. Naomi ignored him, her focus on the room as a whole. I called this meeting because I want to address the elephant in the room, Naomi began, her voice steady but firm. We are at a crossroads as a department. The actions of one officer have brought us to this moment, but this is bigger than him. This is about who we are and what we stand for. She scanned the room, meeting the eyes of as many officers as she could. I know some of you think I'm being too harsh, that I'm overstepping.
Let me be clear, accountability is not optional. If we don't hold ourselves to the highest standard, how can we expect the community to trust us? How can we trust each other? Murmurs rippled through the room, but Naomi pressed on. This isn't about politics. This isn't about race. This is about integrity. And if any of you have a problem with that, my office door is open. But let me warn you, if you think you can undermine me, if you think you can ignore the values this department is supposed to uphold, you will find yourself facing the same scrutiny as Officer Daniels. The room fell silent. Even Mark's smug expression faltered slightly as her words hung in the air. When the meeting ended, Naomi returned to her office, her resolve stronger than ever. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for whatever came next. That evening, Naomi received an email from a reporter at a local news station. The subject line read, "Request for comment." Her pulse quickened as she opened the message. Chief Harris. We've received allegations from Officer Mark Daniels regarding misconduct and bias within the department.
He claims he is being unfairly targeted and has provided documents he says support his case. We would like to offer you the opportunity to respond before running our story.
Please let us know if you're available for an interview.
Naomi stared at the screen, her mind racing. Mark was making his move, and he was playing dirty.
The next day, Naomi agreed to the interview.
She met the reporter, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Lisa Carpenter, in the precinct's conference room. Cameras were set up, the air heavy with anticipation. The interview began with the expected questions about her career and the challenges she faced as chief. Naomi answered them with grace, her tone calm and measured. But then Lisa shifted gears. Chief Harris, Officer Mark Daniels has accused you of unfairly targeting him due to personal bias. He claims this incident is part of a broader pattern of hostility toward him and other officers like him.
How do you respond to these allegations? Naomi didn't flinch.
I respond with facts, she said firmly. Officer Daniels assaulted me in the precinct parking lot without provocation. That incident was captured on video. His actions were not only a violation of protocol but a violation of the trust this department should uphold.
Lisa pressed on. But Daniels has claimed that you've had a vendetta against him since you became chief. He's pointed to past disciplinary actions as evidence. What's your response to that? Naomi leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady.
My vendetta, as he calls it, is a commitment to accountability.
Every disciplinary action I've taken against Officer Daniels has been documented and justified. If he feels targeted, it's because he's been allowed to operate without consequences for too long. That stops under my leadership.
The interview continued, but Naomi held her ground, refusing to let Mark's narrative define the story. Back in the precinct, Mark watched the interview from the break room, his face flushed with anger. Steve Greer stood beside him, shifting uncomfortably. She's tearing you apart, Steve muttered.
Mark slammed his fist on the table.
She thinks she's won, but this isn't over.
What are you going to do? Steve asked, his voice hesitant. Mark's eyes burned with dangerous determination. Whatever it takes. As Naomi left the station that night, her mind replayed the interview.
She knew Mark wouldn't back down easily, but she also knew she couldn't afford to either. This wasn't just about her career, it was about the kind of leader she wanted to be, the example she wanted to set.
The battle was far from over, and Naomi was ready for whatever came next. The fallout from the interview was immediate. By the next morning, Naomi's words had spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, replaying the footage of her calm yet resolute responses.
Many framed her as a leader willing to stand firm against systemic issues.
Social media was divided.
While many praised her for taking a stand, others parroted Mark Daniels' claims, painting her as a vindictive figure out to dismantle the department's traditional structure. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations were quieter, glances sharper. Naomi could feel the weight of scrutiny pressing down on her, but she held her head high as she navigated the hallways.
If her years in law enforcement had taught her anything, it was how to stand tall under pressure. In the meantime, Mark Daniels wasn't retreating.
With the support of a few officers and a local lawyer known for defending controversial cases, he filed a formal complaint with the city council.
The complaint accused Naomi of discrimination, abuse of power, and fostering a hostile work environment.
The move was desperate, riddled with exaggerations and half-truths, but it forced the city to act. A new review panel was convened to investigate the department, placing Naomi and her leadership under intense scrutiny.
Naomi sat in her office, staring at the formal notification she had just received.
The words blurred together as anger and frustration boiled inside her. She had expected resistance, but the lengths to which Mark was willing to go astounded her. She pressed her palms against the desk, taking a deep breath to steady herself.
A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Alan Rodriguez stepped in, his expression grim.
"You've seen it?" he asked, gesturing toward the letter on her desk.
"I've seen it," Naomi replied, her voice steady but tight. Alan sighed as he took a seat across from her. They're escalating, Chief. This isn't just about Daniels anymore.
They're using him as a pawn to undermine everything you've built. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the ceiling for a moment before meeting Alan's gaze.
Let them try. I won't let this department fall back into the old ways, not without a fight.
Alan hesitated, then leaned forward.
Naomi, this panel isn't going to play fair.
They're going to dig into everything, every decision you've made, every officer you've disciplined.
They'll twist it to fit their narrative. Let them, Naomi said, her voice firm. I've done my job with integrity. If they want to question that, I'll answer.
But deep down, she knew Alan was right. The review panel wasn't about seeking truth, it was about protecting those who feared change. And Mark Daniels was the perfect figurehead for their resistance. The day of the first hearing arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. The room was packed with city officials, reporters, and members of the public. Naomi sat at a long table, her face calm but unreadable. Across from her sat the panel, a mix of city council members and independent investigators.
Mark Daniels was present, too, sitting with his lawyer. His expression was smug, his posture defiant.
The proceedings began with a summary of Mark's complaint.
His lawyer painted Naomi as an overzealous leader who had created an environment of fear and hostility.
They emphasized the disciplinary actions taken against Mark, framing them as evidence of a personal vendetta. When it was Naomi's turn to speak, she began with a quiet strength that commanded the room. I'm here today not just to defend my leadership, but to defend the principles that this department should stand for: accountability, integrity, and respect. These principles are not negotiable, and they apply to every officer, myself included. She detailed the events leading up to the parking lot incident, providing context for the disciplinary actions taken against Mark. She presented documented evidence of his misconduct, including witness statements and formal complaints from community members. Each piece of evidence was a blow to Mark's narrative, chipping away at the foundation of his claims.
But the panel wasn't entirely receptive. Some members asked pointed questions, their skepticism apparent.
One councilman leaned forward, his tone sharp. Chief Harris, some might say that your approach to leadership has been divisive. What do you say to those who feel that your actions have eroded morale within the department? Naomi met his gaze without flinching.
Change is always uncomfortable, Councilman. But discomfort is not the same as divisiveness. Morale suffers when misconduct is tolerated, when officers see their peers acting without accountability.
Addressing those issues makes some people uncomfortable.
So be it. My job isn't to make everyone comfortable, it's to lead with integrity.
The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the audience.
Even Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As the hearing continued, Naomi's composure never wavered.
She answered every question with clarity and confidence, refusing to let the panel's biases shake her resolve. But as the day wore on, it became clear that the battle was far from over.
That evening, Naomi returned home exhausted but determined.
She sat at her kitchen table, poring over the next day's agenda when her phone buzzed.
It was a text from Alan. Check your email. You'll want to see this, ***. Curious, Naomi opened her laptop and logged into her email.
Her eyes widened as she read the message from an anonymous source. Attached was a series of documents. Emails, memos, and internal reports that exposed a pattern of collusion within the department. Senior officers had been protecting Mark and others like him, burying complaints and manipulating disciplinary records to shield them from consequences. Naomi's heart pounded as she scrolled through the files. This was the smoking gun she needed. With this evidence, she could not only clear her name but expose the deeper issues plaguing the department.
The next morning, Naomi walked into the hearing with a renewed sense of purpose.
When it was her turn to speak, she presented the documents to the panel, laying out the evidence with precision and clarity. The room buzzed with whispers as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. These documents, Naomi said, her voice steady but charged with emotion, reveal a systemic failure within this department. They show how misconduct has been tolerated, even protected, at the highest levels.
This isn't just about Mark Daniels. This is about a culture that prioritizes loyalty over integrity, silence over accountability. The panel members exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shaken. Even Mark's lawyer looked rattled, whispering furiously into his client's ear.
Naomi turned her gaze to the audience, her voice rising with conviction. If we want to rebuild trust with our community, with each other, we have to confront these truths head-on. Ignoring them will only allow the rot to spread.
The hearing adjourned shortly after, the weight of Naomi's evidence leaving everyone in stunned silence.
As she left the room, reporters clamored for her attention, but she kept walking, her focus unshaken. Back at the precinct, Naomi stood in her office, staring out the window at the city below. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of hope. The truth was out, and the path forward, though difficult, was finally within reach. As the precinct adjusted to the explosive revelations Naomi had delivered at the hearing, the atmosphere grew thick with tension. Officers who had been vocal in their criticism of her now avoided eye contact, their bravado replaced with unease. The documents she'd revealed didn't just implicate Mark Daniels, they exposed years of corruption and complacency that had gone unchecked. The department was a house of cards, and Naomi's actions had set off the winds that would bring it crashing down. In her office, Naomi sat across from Alan, her expression steely but exhausted. A stack of new reports lay on the desk between them, the weight of them almost as heavy as the decision she knew she'd have to make. "This is bigger than we thought," Alan said, flipping through the files. "These aren't just minor cover-ups. Some of these officers, they've been operating like they're untouchable. And Daniels? He's not just a pawn in this. He's been protected for years." Naomi rubbed her temples, the pressure of the past few weeks catching up to her. "We can't let this slide, Alan. If we do, everything I've fought for means nothing. This department needs to be rebuilt from the ground up." Alan hesitated, his voice softening. "Rebuilding means tearing it all down first. You know what kind of backlash that's going to bring, right?" She nodded, her jaw tightening. "I know. But it's the only way." Before Alan could respond, there was a knock at the door. Naomi straightened her posture, instinctively defensive. "Come in." The door opened, and Mark Daniels stepped inside, his expression guarded but determined. Alan's hand hovered over the file in front of him, but Naomi raised a hand, signaling him to let Mark speak. "What do you want, Daniels?" Naomi asked, her tone flat but not hostile. Mark hesitated, the bravado he usually carried nowhere to be seen. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. Naomi exchanged a quick look with Alan, then nodded. "Fine. Talk." Mark shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I saw the documents you turned over at the hearing. The emails, the complaints," he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't know it went that deep." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You didn't know, or you didn't want to know?" Mark flinched at her words but didn't argue. "Maybe both," he admitted. "I always thought. I thought the system was working for me because I was doing things the right way. But now," he swallowed hard, his voice thick with something that sounded almost like regret. "Now I'm not so sure." Alan snorted softly, but Naomi silenced him with a glance. "Why are you here, Daniels?" she asked again, her tone softening just slightly. "What do you want from me?" Mark hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking. "I need to make this right." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Make it right? You spent weeks tearing me down, trying to destroy my reputation, and now, suddenly, you want redemption?" He flinched again, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "I didn't come here to make excuses," he said quietly. "I came here because I can't keep pretending I'm not part of the problem. If you're going to clean this department up, I want to help." Alan leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Why should we trust you, Daniels? You've been fighting against this from the start." Mark met Alan's gaze, his voice bitter but honest. "Because I've got nothing left to lose. The hearing might not have fired me outright, but you've made sure I won't have a career here."
My name's Dirt, no matter what happens. The least I can do is use what I know to help fix this mess.
Naomi studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the room was silent, the tension between them thick and heavy.
Finally, she spoke. If you're serious about this, there's no going back.
You'll be testifying against your own colleagues, exposing the system that protected you.
Are you ready for that?
Mark nodded, though his face betrayed the fear he was trying to hide.
I'm ready. Naomi leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. Then let's get to work.
The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Mark provided names, dates, and details that Naomi and her team cross-referenced with the documents she'd already uncovered. The deeper they dug, the more rot they found. Officers who had manipulated evidence, fabricated reports, and intimidated witnesses were all implicated. What started as a fight between Naomi and Mark had evolved into a full-scale investigation into the department itself.
Mark's cooperation didn't go unnoticed.
Some officers began to distance themselves from him, while others openly confronted him in the precinct. One day, as he walked through the locker room, Officer Steve Greer stepped in front of him, blocking his path.
"What the hell are you doing, Mark?" Steve demanded, his voice low and angry. "You're selling us out to her?"
Mark met his glare, his expression weary but resolute.
"I'm telling the truth, Steve. If you've got a problem with that, maybe you're part of the problem too."
Steve's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He stepped aside, letting Mark pass, though the tension between them was palpable. Meanwhile, Naomi was preparing for the next hearing, where the evidence they had gathered would be presented. She knew the stakes were higher than ever. The department's reputation, and her own, was on the line. Late one evening, as she sat in her office going over her notes, there was another knock at the door.
This time it was Alan. "You've got to see this," he said, handing her a folder. Naomi opened it, her eyes scanning the contents quickly.
Her expression hardened as she read. The folder contained leaked memos from the city council, revealing that some members were actively working to discredit her. They had been in contact with media outlets, feeding them stories that painted her as a tyrant and a divisive leader. "They're scared," Alan said, his voice quiet but firm.
"You're threatening their status quo, and they're hitting back." Naomi closed the folder, her jaw tight.
"Let them," she said.
"I've got the truth on my side." Alan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth.
"That's what I thought you'd say." The day of the next hearing arrived, and the room was packed once again. This time, Naomi and Mark sat at the same table, an unlikely alliance that drew curious glances from the audience. As Naomi presented the new evidence, the room buzzed with murmurs. The memos, emails, and testimonies painted a damning picture of a department that had been broken for years.
Mark's testimony was the final nail in the coffin.
His detailed accounts exposed the inner workings of the corrupt system. When it was over, Naomi looked out at the panel, her voice steady but filled with emotion.
"This is our chance to do better, to be better.
If we don't take it, we're not just failing ourselves, we're failing the people we swore to serve." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air.
As the panel deliberated, Naomi and Mark sat in the waiting area.
The tension between them had shifted into a quiet understanding.
"You think they'll listen?" Mark asked, his voice uncertain.
Naomi glanced at him, her expression thoughtful.
"I think they'll have no choice."
The decision came swiftly, and it was as monumental as the case itself. The panel, faced with the irrefutable evidence Naomi had presented, ruled not only in her favor but also issued a sweeping mandate for immediate reforms within the department. High-ranking officers implicated in the cover-ups were suspended, pending further investigation.
Mark Daniels' fate was sealed.
He would resign quietly, forfeiting his badge and any future in law enforcement. But there was more. His testimony had been pivotal in dismantling the corrupt network.
While it couldn't erase his actions, it offered a path to redemption he never thought he'd need.
Naomi stood in the courtroom as the decision was read aloud, her head high and her heart pounding.
The vindication wasn't just personal, it was symbolic.
She had fought not just for herself but for the integrity of the badge and for those who believed that justice, no matter how slow, was worth pursuing. After the hearing, Mark approached her, his posture awkward, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and regret. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their history looming between them. "I guess this is it," Mark finally said, his voice low. Naomi studied him, her gaze steady. "It doesn't erase what you did," she said evenly. "But what you've done since it mattered." Mark nodded, swallowing hard. "I've got a lot to figure out, a lot to fix." "You'll have the time to do that now," she replied. "Use it wisely." He gave her a faint, almost hopeful smile before turning to leave. Watching him walk away, Naomi felt a strange sense of closure. He was no longer her adversary, but he wasn't her ally either. He was simply a man who had faced his own demons and, for once, chosen the harder path. Back at the precinct, the mood was one of quiet upheaval. The officers who had supported Mark now kept their heads down, their confidence shaken. Others approached Naomi, their respect for her evident in their words and actions. Change was slow, but it was happening. Alan met her in her office, his expression lighter than it had been in weeks. "So," he said, dropping into the chair across from her. "What's next, Chief?" Naomi leaned back in her chair, a rare smile tugging at her lips. "We rebuild. Brick by brick." Alan grinned. "I had a feeling you'd say that." The reforms began almost immediately. Training programs were overhauled, new policies on accountability were implemented, and community leaders were invited to take part in shaping the department's future. Naomi led the charge, her determination unwavering. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance, but she also knew it was worth it. Months later, the department held a ceremony honoring officers who had gone above and beyond in service to their community. Naomi stood at the podium, her speech brief but heartfelt. "Change isn't easy," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "But it's necessary. Together, we've taken the first steps toward becoming the department our city deserves. There's still work to do, but I know we're on the right path." The applause that followed was loud and genuine. As she stepped down, she caught sight of familiar faces in the crowd, officers who had once doubted her, now standing with her. It was a moment she would carry with her for the rest of her career. Naomi's journey wasn't just about justice, it was about resilience and the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. Mark's path, though different, was no less significant. He had lost everything, but in that loss, he found clarity. He left the city, starting fresh in a quiet town where he worked with at-risk youth, teaching them about choices and consequences. It was a far cry from his days as an officer, but it was work that mattered, a kind of penance he could live with. As for Naomi, she continued to lead with integrity and courage, becoming a symbol of hope and progress not just for her department but for the community as a whole. Her story wasn't just one of triumph, it was a reminder that true leadership is about service, accountability, and the willingness to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. Now that the story has unfolded, let's take a moment to reflect. What would you have done in Naomi's position? Could you have stood as tall under the weight of such pressure? And what about Mark? Does his redemption resonate with you, or do you believe he should have faced harsher consequences? These are the questions that stories like this leave us with, and they're worth thinking about. Life isn't always black and white, it's messy, complicated, and often unfair. But what matters is how we respond to the challenges we face, how we hold ourselves and others accountable, and how we strive to make things better. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, share your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge, surprise, and inspire.